Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. We'll also talk about the various methods and devices that have been deployed throughout time. I'm your host, Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Today we'll be covering that horrifying, notorious, bloody, but oh so effective device known as the guillotine. And at the risk of sounding juvenile or offensive, or maybe both, we're calling this episode Giving Head. As might be expected, most of our story will concentrate on the French Revolution, where it was most utilized and most remembered, but we'll also take the microscope to similar, perhaps more crude contraptions that preceded it, and we'll delve deeper into its prolific use in a neighboring country during its own reign of terror, almost 2 centuries later. So get your massage table out and lay prone on your stomach and relax and hear the story of the guillotine. We have to start with some of its antecedents. And again, while the guillotine will always be synonymous with late 18th century France and that country in general, various iterations of the device reach back long before that time, and there's no particular date or place that we can peg to the actual origin of this contraption, but the first contemporary accounts of, quote, beheading machines date from as early as 13th century Europe and the British Isles. We can see renderings of something similar during the late medieval and early modern period of what appears to be crude forms of the later guillotine in both the Italian and German city-states as well as in Ireland. But the first of its kind that we have real written accounts of is what was known as the Halifax gibbet, and this stood in the town square of Halifax, West Yorkshire in England. It was described as a wooden structure about 15 feet high, with a sharpened axe affixed to the top by a rope. And the axe was weighted down by lead as to hasten its propulsion. The condemned would be laid prone and face down on a board, and the head immobilized by a pillory. This was later known in France as the lunettes. And then the rope would either be cut or a pin of some sort pulled by the executioner, and the axe would drop, either severing the head or sometimes crushing the head with blunt force. This bloody head would then be deposited into a bucket or a basket, where it would then be held aloft for all to cheer or jeer or puke. And this is peculiar, as manual beheading would have been the modus operandi of the day, but for some reason in Halifax it was the preferred method of dispatching the reprobates of the region. It was employed for more than 300 years, from basically the 14th century to the 17th century, and it seems about 100 folks or so cried their heads off there, which is a sizable number when you consider the provincial area in which it was situated. And a replica of this particular murder device exists today in that Yorkshire village that bears its name. There were other similar devices that were known to exist elsewhere in Europe for the most part, but were typically used for specific executions and were not permanent structures. Something called the maiden. No, not the band, nor the fictitious device that you may have seen in cheesy displays. This was also used in Scotland, primarily in the 17th century, and it's estimated that 150 people were executed by this method during that period in that country. These included prominent members of Clan Campbell and James Douglas, the 4th Earl of Morton, who possibly actually introduced the device to Scotland after witnessing a decapitation at the Halifax gibbet. There was another device that I can't really pronounce. It's called the Manaya. Any folks in Italy, please help us out. This was in Italy, and it was also used during this period, as was the plank or plank, which was deployed in Germany and the Low Countries. As we get to the actual guillotine, which is about to happen next, there were some precursors. Well, now we're on to France, and before we get into the gory details of its use in that country, there is a point of order here. Its original name was the Louisette, and this is so called after its originator, a man named Antoine Louis, who was a prominent physician of his day, and he, along with another man named Tobias Schmidt, actually created the prototype of what we all can picture today as the guillotine. The original French version was constructed in Strasbourg, and it was shipped to Paris, where it was soon to work overtime for roughly 5 years and then part-time for many years following that. And in one of history's great ironies, King Louis XVI played a very active role in its development, only to die by the method of his partial creation in due course, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Well, now let's get down to the brass tacks, and the reason we know the name is because of another man who happened to be a surgeon, and that's Joseph Ignace Guillotine. This man, this doctor, was in opposition to capital punishment, but as his voice would have been drowned out by the masses who thirsted for retribution of all sorts, he sought to perfect a quick and painless way of dispatching the condemned. And this may seem hypocritical, maybe to us today, but his intentions, considering the time in which he lived, should probably be thought of as humane. And this is where he suggests the method to Louis XVI as a more suitable form of execution versus other barbaric methods deployed at the time that often harkened back to very dark and medieval times. The king approved of the device, and in fact, he did make several suggestions regarding its improvement. Louis himself suggested the beveled edge blade to replace the crescent-shaped blade. So notably, and one of the greatest ironies perhaps in history, he would die by the actual device he approved and perfected. We should get back to the namesake of this device, Dr. G. And I'll read here what his pronouncements were as to what he tried to do by this method. And this would have been a very enlightened idea in his time. And he says this:
all punishments for the same class of crime shall be the same, regardless of the criminal. When the death sentence is applied, it will be by decapitation, carried out by a machine. The family of the guilty party will not suffer any legal discrimination. It will be illegal to anyone to reproach the guilty party's family about his or her punishment. The property of the convicted shall not be confiscated, and the bodies of those executed shall be returned to the family if so requested.
It has long been thought that Dr. G himself perished by the same device that bears his name, but this is erroneous. Turns out that another doctor that bore the same surname did actually die by this method in Lyon, and that happened years later. Before we get to the fast and furious that's about to happen over the next few years, we need to mention a highwayman called Nicolas Pelletier, and he was killed in the guillotine kind of as a guinea pig in 1792. But he is an anomaly of sorts, as this device would claim the lives of many, many thousands in very short order. So after a short break, we will get to the French Revolution and the use of the guillotine during the Reign of Terror. Well, after the unfortunate fate of Monsieur Pelletier, the Jacobin regime that had taken power in revolutionary France at this time really loved this device. Their avarice and hatred of the ancien regime grew more and more hateful and more vengeful. They hunted down lots of people, aristocrats, priests, basically all the bourgeoisie, and they were bent on killing them all. But in the end, they would also end up killing their own, and that's why history knows this era as the Reign of Terror. The first aristocrat to die by this method was Louis Coligny d'Anclement. I'm sorry, I'm sure, no pun intended, I'm sure I've butchered that name. And he died in August of 1792, soon after Mr. Pelletier, I guess. Most of the executions occur at the Place de Révolution, previously Place Louis XIV, and now Place de la Concorde in central Paris. During this frenzied period in French history, really in human history, this was a major spectator sport with huge crowds. There was even a restaurant directly across the street called Cabaret de la Guillotine. There were many Parisians who attended the beheadings on a daily basis. There were also a number of groupies who would sit in front and knit between the beheadings. And the numbers of executions by guillotine during the heart of the Reign of Terror are truly stunning. In a roughly 1 year period between the summers of 1793 and 1794, 17,000 souls were executed. For some perspective, the population of France during this period is put at about 28 million, and today the population in the United States is 330 million or so. It's about 12 times more. And in recent years, the United States, for instance, which is famous for capital punishment, has averaged fewer than 20 executions per year. So during the Reign of Terror, they killed 17,000 people in a much smaller population within 1 year. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were famously guillotined several months apart from each other in 1793. Other famous victims of the guillotine, such as Danton, Saint-Just, and Robespierre, were ironically some of its most ardent supporters. But each of them lost their heads in 1794. And this device remained in use, albeit far less frequently, for almost another 200 years, primarily used for the most dangerous criminals and those accused of various war crimes. The last public use was in 1939, and the condemned man was a German thief and murderer named Eugene Weidmann. The crowd became unruly at this spectacle. In the face of World War II, public appetite for execution in general and public execution in particular had begun to wear thin. For the rest of its history in France, roughly another 40 years, execution by this method took place inside prison walls, out of view of the general public. The last execution of a woman in France was Marie-Louise Giraud, who was killed during the Vichy years for having been found guilty of performing scores of abortions, which were illegal during this time. And the final use of the guillotine in France occurred in Marseille in 1977. And that victim was Hamida Jundabi, a Tunisian-born man who committed a murder in France, and he remains, in fact, the last person officially beheaded by any Western government. 15 other condemned prisoners had their sentences commuted by the then president, François Mitterrand, in 1981, and that ended capital punishment in France. So as the guillotine is ubiquitous to France and its use was irregular after the Reign of Terror, anybody want to guess where and when it ends up in equally deadly fashion? Anybody? Anybody out there? Well, that would be Nazi Germany, about 150 years later. You want to guess how many were killed there by the blade? Oh, it's about the exact same number, 17,000, roughly. Does that number sound familiar? And though we associate the Third Reich with the Holocaust, we need to look at Hitler before that and the fascist regime he built before turning his designs to all-out war. And he came to power in 1933, several years before the bullets started flying in Gdansk and Danzig, prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. So I'll say it again. We don't pontificate on this podcast. That's not what we're doing. We're just trying to tell stories. There's so much written about this topic. I think we all know that fascists, by definition, rout out all opposition to them. And so when Hitler came to power, he was scouring for all that opposed him. And these were the socialists, and we can argue about that later, as Hitler's regime, of course, were the National Socialists, but that's a later discussion. He was routing out the liberal class and all sorts of others who dared question him. But back to the guillotine. The device was adopted and perfected in Germany during the Weimar period. And it was known as the Kopfmaschine, or Fehlbell, if I have that right, the beheading machine in Germany. And it was usually constructed of metal rather than wood. And 7 seconds was the typical time of death. This was always done behind prison walls. In fact, during the whole of the Third Reich, that's 12 years, the Nazis executed a staggering 17,000 people, as we just mentioned, mostly German Christian or a-religious people, citizens who dared oppose the regime from its sickening founding through the war years and its inglorious fall. And as we all know, the gas was left to the Jews and the gypsies, homosexuals, disabled people, and all the other so-called undesirables. So of these 17,000 people, the group ran the gamut and was called, at least the most prominent of them were called the White Rose Movement. And it was comprised of students, normal citizens of the like, who dared oppose the Fuhrer. I hope I'm not being too sentimental here as we commemorate a few of these brave souls who dared to stare down evil in its own eye and paid the price in the guillotine for having done so. And I'm thinking of Willy Graf, Kurt Huber, and Sophie and Hans Skoll, and the thousands of other brave people that were murdered for simply speaking out against a villain. Whenever there's this number of people executed, there's always a practitioner, or several, and we've talked about Albert Pierpoint. We'll mention him again here soon. We think of Jack Ketch going back to the Middle Ages, and somebody's got to do this job. But in the case of Germany, its chief practitioner was a man named Johann Reichart, who was the primary executioner in Germany during a very long period that stretched from the Weimar years through the Third Reich and beyond. And he is known to have executed more than 3,000 people in his career by various methods, preferably the guillotine. And he seems to be so expert in his craft, he was employed by not only the Nazi government, but also by the Allies. And he worked alongside Albert Pierpoint, who we've covered here. And it's confounding to me, is it to you? That a man who killed people on behalf of Hitler is now plying his craft with the Allies and killing the basic friends of Hitler. And like Mr. Pierpoint, he expressed regret later in life about capital punishment itself. Well, it's a little too late, I guess, as the thousands that went to their death by these men may have had a different opinion.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, All rights reserved and preserved.